Dear friends, greetings. I regret that we cannot meet in person this year, but I'm grateful for this opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. In this brief presentation, I would like to reflect on the role of hybridity in the formation of Christian identity throughout history. While hybridity can be manifest in many dimensions of the Christian life, such as theology and ritual, following the lead of post-colonial studies and the anthropology of Christianity, I shall mainly discuss cultural hybridity. I shall first suggest three ways in which cultural hybridity can be incorporated into Christian identity. Then I shall suggest some of the effects that hybridity has had on the way that persons have experienced their Christian lives. And finally, I shall ask some theological questions about the role of hybridity in Christian identity, whether it should not be simply normal for some people, but normative for all of us, and if so, in what ways. Covering such a range of content in less than 25 minutes means that this presentation is more in the mode of suggestions rather than a deeply probed academic exploration. Yet I am drawing on the rich studies of a number of scholars and organizing material in a way that I hope will lead to further study. Before I launch into my main subject, let me make 2 points. First, I am aware that the whole notion of hybridity has been called into question in recent anthropological literature. One of my favorite authors calls it discredited. I think this is an exaggeration. It is an overcorrection for the pervasiveness of the idea in past decades. Suffice it to say that hybridity is good at explaining certain phenomena, but not others. It is helpful in examining certain contexts, but not every context. Second, I wish to be clear about what I do not imagine hybridity to be. For my purposes, hybridity is not the merging of two well-defined and distinct cultures to form a new hybrid creation. This, in fact, happens in the plant world, from where we get our basic ideas of hybridization. However, hybridity in human experience can be, and often is, fashioned from multiple sources whose boundaries and centers may not be clearly marked. I myself have written about the polyvalent identities of Christians, by which I mean that Christian identity is an amalgamation of different cultures and ideologies, each having varying degrees of importance for identity formation and being more or less well-defined. In this presentation, however, for the sake of simplicity and clarity, the examples I'm going to use will illustrate hybridity that results from the joining together of two rather distinct cultures. So, on to the topic of hybridity and Christian identity. For the next few minutes, what I would like to do is suggest three different ways that hybridity becomes a part of Christian identity. I shall provide historical and biblical examples of these ways. The first way that hybridity becomes a part of Christian identity is that it is imposed upon the community of faith. I shall call this forced hybridity. So missionaries or other church authorities may insist that people who wish to follow Christ must adopt foreign elements into their identity. Modern missionaries from the West have generally been accused, often with good reason, of forcing hybridity on converts by telling them that they need to take on certain required elements of so-called Christian civilization. Such ethnocentrism is rightly criticized. Forced hybridity has been the norm for missionary work in the Americas until the late 20th century. Franciscan missionaries working in 16th century Mexico and John Eliot working in 17th century Massachusetts demanded that indigenous Christians take on certain elements of Western civilization. At the same time, both also allowed and even insisted on some continuity with pre-Christian identity by translating Christian texts into local languages. They thereby ensured, whether they knew it or not, that the Christian religion would import ideas, assumptions, behaviors, and affects from existing local religious traditions, thereby creating a hybrid indigenous Christian identity. One scriptural example of forced hybridity comes from Acts 15, in the passage where the decisions of the Jerusalem Council regarding requirements for Gentiles who wanted to join the Jesus is the Messiah movement are spelled out. The council decided, on the one hand, that Gentiles need not be circumcised to join this movement with its origins in Judaism. On the other hand, Gentiles were to, quote, abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality, end quote. In other words, they were to keep some of the requirements of the Jewish community. Acts 15 imposes a socio-religious hybridity on Gentile followers of Jesus the Christ. Before we move on, it should be noticed that forced hybridity can come from outside the Christian community. At times, Christians can be forced to be religiously or culturally hybrid by a society that does not consider itself Christian. An example comes from Japan, where from the 17th to the 19th centuries, government officials attempted to eradicate Christianity completely. Christian believers were forced either to accept martyrdom or to renounce their religion through a number of ritualized processes. While numerous Christians did go through the rituals of renouncing their faith, they also secretly clung to it until the ban on Christianity was lifted in the mid-1800s. These secret Christians developed hybrid rituals and hybrid beliefs to sustain them through the centuries of persecution. A second way that hybridity can be incorporated into Christian identity has occurred when Christians in the society willingly, even eagerly, take on foreign cultural elements of the religion. I call this desired hybridity. There are far more examples of this in history than we would like to admit. Indeed, now that ideas like enculturation and contextualization are simply accepted as normative in many missiological circles, desired hybridity can be a missiological embarrassment, a sign of failure of the missionary to convey to the missionized that the gospel is fully available to them in their own indigenous culture. The idea of hybridity, thus, is in tension with the principle of translatability. One of the more interesting disputes over appropriate Christian culture occurred in North Indian Protestant circles in the 19th century. At a missionary conference held in the city of Allahabad in India in 1872 to 73, a number of British and American missionaries went to great length to detail how the Christians connected to their missions were not abandoning Indian culture, but were being trained to avoid, quote, the evils of Europeanizing, end quote. I have found similar missionary views among some American Episcopalians working in the Philippines in the early 20th century. The European missionaries at Allahabad were concerned that Indian Christians were eagerly and rapidly becoming westernized. However, Indian church leaders asked the missionaries to take a step back. For example, the Indian Presbyterian pastor, the Reverend K.C. Chatterjee, argued that missionaries should not interfere with the converts' adopted mode of living, the manner and the matter of their dress, and their household management. Rather, missionaries should allow Indian converts to experiment with and create their own hybrid, and he certainly did not use that term, their own hybrid Christian culture, borrowing freely from the Western lifestyles of the missionaries from whom they had learned about the Christian faith. Throughout history, some Christians have willingly appropriated foreign elements of culture for their own expressions of Christianity. For a biblical example of such hybridity, we can think of the figure of Ruth, who, despite the pleas of her mother-in-law that she return to her home and country, insisted that she would go to Israel and live there. In her now famous words, Ruth said to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Ruth wanted to become a part of Naomi's clan, the Ephrathites. Interestingly, however, Ruth continued to be known in Naomi's hometown as a Moabite. Her origins continued to be part of her identity, making it a hybrid one. A third way in which hybridity can be incorporated into Christian identity is through what I call reflexive hybridity. What I mean by this is that at times people combine cultural elements from disparate sources without purposefully thinking about it, without experiencing any cognitive dissonance between them. The hybridity which they manifest seems to come naturally to them. The work of Devaka Premawardhana in a rural district of Mozambique illustrates this point. Premawardhana argues that mobility is part of the traditional lifeways of the Makua people, among whom he did his fieldwork. This predilection for movement continued among the Makua who became Pentecostals, but not in any deliberative way. Rather, it was a part of their traditional culture that they simply continued to observe as Christians. As a result, much to the chagrin of the African Pentecostal missionaries from outside the region, many Makua Pentecostals felt perfectly free to move in and out of their churches. The Makua imported their mobility in a rather matter-of-fact manner into a Christianity that forcefully, and in this case, not very successfully, preached and promoted stability. In the Bible, it seems to me that in the book of Acts, so-called God-fearers, such as Lydia and Cornelius, come off as such unself-consciously hybrid persons in Luke's rendering of early Christian history. They are not Jewish, yet they honor and follow God as he is understood in the Jewish religious tradition. This does not seem to be in any way remarkable to them, at least in Luke's view. They are portrayed as reflexively hybrid. So these are three ways, and there are probably more, that hybridity can become an integral part of Christian identity. The results of such incorporation can also be quite varied. Again, let me provide three categories. First, hybridity can cause moral torment, to use the words of the anthropologist Joel Robbins. Robbins did his fieldwork in the early 1990s among the European people living in the Western Highlands of Papua New Guinea. The European were living with what Robbins calls two cultural logics, the indigenous and the recently adopted Pentecostal Christian. Robbins writes, the European understood each of these logics in its own terms, and they hold fiercely to both of them. But especially in the area of morality, the Christian and indigenous systems the European are trying to juggle pointedly contradict one another. It is through the cracked lens of this contradiction that the European view their contemporary social life, end quote. Other Christians have experienced such spiritually and morally painful hybridity. The late Roman Catholic sister Marie-Therese Archambault once said, as a native Catholic, the very faith you embrace is one that was used to destroy you, that collaborated with the government in cultural genocide. This is the terrible agony, the terrible irony of being Native American and Catholic. However, hybridity does not necessarily need to be experienced as moral torment. Sometimes it is experienced as an opportunity for crafting a new religious and social identity. Many of the North Indian Christians who were freely adopting Western cultural ideals in the 19th and 20th centuries came from the lowest and most oppressed strata of Indian society. Upper castes and classes had consistently blocked avenues of self-improvement to them. So when the possibility of forging a new religious and social life, the two being intimately tied to one another, was made possible through the acceptance of Christianity brought by Western missions, many eagerly experimented with creating a hybrid social and religious life as a means of claiming and asserting their own dignity. For such converts, hybridity was life-giving. The irony is that both Indian dominant classes and Western missions could try to derail these experiments in hybridity. Finally, hybridity can allow Christians to amalgamate themselves in a religiously pluralistic society. Syrian Orthodox Christians in the South Indian state of Kerala, for example, have adopted customs and behaviors from their Hindu neighbors that allow the Christians to flourish as a vital part of Kerala's society. Historic Christian communities in the Middle East have for centuries adopted lifeways of their Muslim neighbors, making the Christian presence in society perfectly normal and accepted. The religious identity of the Christians is never questioned by the neighbors of other faith traditions, yet neither is the hybridity, which allows them to live peacefully in their pluralistic societies. One important note to make is that Christian communities incorporate hybridity by having it enforced, by seeking it out, or by reflexively practicing it, does not determine whether hybridity is experienced as moral torment, as opportunity, or as amalgamation into society. The European who experienced moral torment due to the clash of indigenous and imported religions did not adopt Christianity due to mission work. Rather, they sought it out for themselves, even though it was accompanied by significant moral conundrums and problems. An enforced hybridity, for example, in the case of gender relations in non-Western societies, could be experienced as opportunity by women and men who adopted certain aspects of Western gender norms. So it is important to keep distinct in our minds the ways in which hybridity is incorporated into Christian identity and the varying results of those modes of incorporation. The final question I want to consider is a theological one, namely, whether hybridity is not simply a facet of the lives of many Christians, but in fact should be the norm for Christian identity. Are there strands of the Christian tradition that insist on some kind of cultural hybridity for the faithful? In a famous 2nd century letter to Diognetus, the Christian author lays out, among other things, a case for the Christian life as a hybrid one. He writes, Christians are indistinguishable from other people, either by nationality, language, or customs. With regard to dress, food, and manner of life in general, they follow the customs of whatever city they happen to be living in, whether it be Greek or foreign. And yet there is something extraordinary about their lives. They live in their own countries as though they were only passing through. They play their full roles as citizens, but labor under all the disabilities of aliens. Any country can be their homeland, but for them, their homeland, wherever it may be, is a foreign country. Like others, they marry and have children, but they do not expose the children. They have their meals in common, but they do not share their wives. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. In this passage, the writer develops the theological case for a hybrid Christian identity in which believers live in their lands as both citizens and as aliens who are pledged to a heavenly kingdom. Andrew Walls described this dual allegiance as the indigenizing principle and the pilgrim principle, which are in fundamental tension with each other. Leslie Newbigin worried that Christians too often gave into the temptation of making their true allegiance to the worldly polity rather than to the heavenly one. Beginning with the New Testament, important voices of the Christian tradition insist that hybridity, which is manifest in the culture or lifestyles of Christians, is very much a part of Christian identity. It is important to note that the epistle to Diognetus does not insist that Christians develop a hybridity that partakes of two or more human cultures. Rather, the source of their hybridity is a spiritual and theological conviction regarding a Christian's ultimate allegiance and therefore their social identity. There is one other way in which cultural hybridity seems to be called for as part of Christian identity. Such hybridity is clearly manifest in two of the most ancient churches, the Ethiopian Orthodox and the South Indian Orthodox. In both Ethiopia and South India, the Christian communities ensured until the modern era that the head of their churches came from outside their land and culture. In the case of Ethiopia, the Abuna came from Egypt. In India, the Catholicos, or Metropolitan, came from Mesopotamia. This meant that these ancient churches had as their head a person who did not speak their language or know their customs, at least when he arrived. Yet the churches insisted on this arrangement. It was a material and bodily sign of their connection to the worldwide church. To incorporate a foreigner not incidentally, but as the titular head of their communion, signaled to themselves, to their neighbors, and to the church universal that these Christian communities, separated geographically and culturally from Mediterranean and Mesopotamian Christianity, were still a vital part of that church universal. I believe that material and bodily hybridity of some sort is required of any Christian community. The reason is that we are a universal body of believers, and this universality needs to be incarnate. The various Christian traditions, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Pentecostal, have developed various means of expressing this universality through hybridity. Yet the possibility for and temptation to monocultural Christianity remains strong. Monocultural Christianity has also been encouraged by certain 20th century trends in missiology, which have emphasized the role of local cultures in forming Christian identity and expression. Such an emphasis is understandable and even salubrious in the face of Western power in secular and ecclesial matters. Yet perhaps this emphasis encourages us to forget that the church also needs to manifest not only in its belief, but also in its actions that it is a multicultural body. What would it mean for white churches in the United States to manifest bodily their unity with their African American, Asian American, Latino, Indigenous, and immigrant sisters and brothers? What kind of changes in our church cultures? What kinds of material hybridity would that entail? It may be that we need to pay more attention to the apostolic injunctions of the Jerusalem Council, which allowed Gentile followers of Jesus the Christ to develop their own cultural expressions of Christianity, but also demanded that they incorporate certain vital elements of Jewish life into those Gentile expressions. Thank you very much.